My name is Roxy, as you've heard, and I'm called a master gardener with the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Chemung County, New York. I don't see myself as a master, but rather as an experimenter, a student of nature, as I am always learning. And I hope you gain from my talk today. I do have a lot to cover, so let's dig in. This is a picture of a garden that's been covered for the winter. I say put your garden to bed. And it's very important to do this unless you like lots of work. In the past, before I learned about this technique, I would spend lots of time in the spring weeding before I ever could plant. And a few years ago, my daughter started an 8x8 garden and raised bed, and her garden was so bad in early June, the weeds were about 4 foot tall, that I decided for her birthday, which is in early June, to sit in her garden and pull out all her weeds for a birthday present because it was very tedious and a very long job. And when she came home that day, she saw me sitting in the garden and she said, "Mom, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, this is your birthday present. I'm taking out all your weeds." And she looked and she said, "Well, where's the dirt? It's gone." And when you have to pull out large weeds like that, even though I shook off the bottoms, a lot of your soil does disappear. So this makes life so much easier. And she has now covered hers with a tarp over the winter, because I told her no more birthday presents like that. So this is covered with straw and leaves. Some people like to remove all their detritus in the fall, their dead stems and dead leaves and so forth. But other people like to leave them up for the animals to have perhaps some food during the winter. This person took most of it out. And you can also use cardboard, newspaper, chicken coop bedding, or you could use a tarp. Black plastic, if you put it on in the spring, is helpful because it could warm up your soil. And soil temperature is what is really important to know when it's time to plant those seeds or transplants. If you put clear plastic down, it's going to act like a greenhouse and it could encourage weeds to grow. So beware of that. So remove in the spring that overwintered material, not necessarily the leaves and straw, but the overwintered material so you have your soil ready without having any roots in it. Don't rush. If you love gardening, it's so hard to hold yourself back. This time of year, the soil's around 40 to 50, and the air is, you're seeing 40 to 50 or 60 this year, with nights a bit cooler in the 40s. And you think, because you go out and it feels so good, you want to plant. But usually in the southern tier, it's generally spoken about Memorial Day that it's a good time to plant. But beware, that's just an estimate. Last year, we had our last frost, at least where I live, was on June 6th. And so you may have to cover your garden with something which we'll talk about later. Some plants are early plants and can be put out earlier, like peas. They're good when the soil's 50 degrees. But beware, if you do that with seeds and it's cold and rainy, they could all rot. And that happened to me last year. You want to be sure to prepare your soil. You want to remove those old stems and so forth, and put 2 to 4 inches of compost or other fertilizer. And you'll have to choose between organic or chemical, and we will talk about that later also. And you want to plant only when your soil's in good tilth. And good tilth means that it's got the right kind of moisture. And so you want to take a piece, a clump, put it in your hand and squeeze it. And if you can squeeze it and it stays together when you open your hand in a compressed ball and no water's coming out, then you're in pretty good shape. You don't want it to be crumbly either. So you do want to think about fertilizing, and you can do soil testing with a pH meter. This is a pH testing item. You can also get little machines. You take the soil, put it in water and test it. You want your pH be between 6 and 7. Otherwise, your crops won't be able to get the nutrients out of the soil. If your pH is less than 6, 6, you're too acidic, and you can add lime at about 5 pounds per 100 square feet. If it's basic, which is greater than 7, you can add sphagnum moss, elemental sulfur, aluminum sulfate, iron sulfate, or acidifying nitrogen. There are organic mulches, and if you put organic mulches, which is basically a type of compost, it builds up the organic matter, which is very healthy for your soil. CCE, does have kits, and you take soil from several places in your garden and send it in. It usually costs around $12, and you should do this every 3 to 5 years. Some people say 5 to 7 years. I'm sorry, I'm missing a few slides. I thought I had fixed this, but so you want to choose between organic and chemical, and you fertilize, your plants need 16 different nutrients. The major ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Here's the differences between organic and chemical fertilizers. And basically, chemical does not have the microorganisms in it that the organic does. There's the nitrogen in the soil with the chemical goes into the soil very quickly. With organic, it's slower to go in the soil, but it's more permanent. It adds more micronutrients. And if you're really in a hurry, you can make a tea out of compost or vermicompost, which is worm poop, and also just regular compost, and pour that on your soil. So here's a picture of a package of a chemical fertilizer, and there's 3 numbers always, and this is quite a common fertilizer. The first number is nitrogen, so there's 15% nitrogen in this fertilizer. There's phosphorus of 5%, and the last one is potassium of 10%. And if you get that test, the nice thing about the CCE test that you do, they actually don't do the test, they send it away. But if you get that test, they will tell you what nutrients you need and also suggestions of what to put on and how much. You can make your own organic fertilizer, and this will be in the, you could look at this, our presentation later also, and bring this back up. But using bone meal, rock phosphate, lime, and alfalfa meal is a wonderful organic fertilizer. And composting items, you have more in your house than you ever could imagine. Food scraps, of course, you have grass, you have leaves, you have eggshells and coffee grinds. A warning, coffee grounds should be used, and of course most people would not want to throw them out unless they were used. They're acidic prior to being used to make coffee, but they're not acidic. They're very neutral when they've been used to make coffee. Eggshells, they're very hard and takes years to biodegrade, but if you simmer them in water, dry them, and then pulverize them in a blender, it makes this lovely powder. It gives it a huge amount of surface area and will go into your soil much, much quicker. And as I mentioned, you can make tea emulsions, and I forgot to mention seaweed as well. And believe it or not, you can actually use your own urine. It's very high in nitrogen, and just let it sit a couple of weeks and then dilute it. So there's another way to renew something that you get rid of. If you plant peas or beans, you can use an inoculant, and it gives extra nitrogen to those plants to help, the microbes will help it grow. They're very heavy nitrogen feeders, so that's why that works well if you feel you need it. Question, when to apply fertilizer? Organic is best done in the fall, so the microorganisms have time to multiply and biodegrade. Chemical does go in the ground faster. You can do a soil test again to be sure. If you haven't planted a garden before, or the second year as well, it's best to put your chemical fertilizer on about a month before you're going to plant, because it can burn your plants. Now, how to fertilize? There are several ways, and this is in the downloadable book. You can band, and that's when you dig a hole near where your seeds are going to be, put in your fertilizer about 3 inches deep and cover it up 1.5 to 2 inches. And then off to the side, you will put your seeds. You can broadcast, which is basically like planting grass seed, just sort of scattering it around and working it in a little. You can side dress, and this is for after your plants are growing. Be sure not to get any on the leaves of your plant. Put it along the edge a couple inches away from the plants and just scratch it up, even just with your gloves if you want. And we have in the hole. And in the hole is wonderful for transplants, and particularly tomatoes. Works great putting some fertilizer in the holes. Now you have to decide. Are you on the left going to have seeds, or on you right, you're going to have transplants? The seeds advantages, of course, is that you can buy a whole lot more varieties, especially if you get one of those seed catalogs that will, for gardeners, are sort of like the toy catalog when you were a kid. You can get heirlooms or hybrids. It saves money overall. You may say, oh, this is a lot more seed than I need this year, but you can save those seeds. And the best way to do that is in some type of nearly airtight container that you can put in a cool place around 50 degrees and put a desiccant in there to keep the moisture out. And that could be silica, little packs of silica, or you can buy some silica, or you can actually put cornstarch into a little coffee filter bag and seal it up and throw it in the can. Advantages of transplants, there's your seeds, and advantages of transplants that they save you money if you take the seeds and make your own transplants. And you can make otherwise it is more costly, of course, because you're only getting maybe 4 for the price of a whole package, 4 plants for the price of a whole package of seeds. You can make your own seed starting mix as well, with 2 parts potting soil, 2 parts peat or coconut coir, and 1 part perlite or vermiculite. Now be aware that I always encourage people to use coconut coir because peat moss is not renewable. It's not sustainable. It took millions of years to make that peat moss. But if you use coconut coir, we can grow more coconuts. And so it works just as well, and it is sustainable. Here's a picture of a package. A lot of people buy a package, look at the front and say, okay, here's a wonderful lettuce package, but forget to turn it over. Well, do turn it over because there's lots of things to learn on the back of the package. In the southern tier, we're in Zone 5B for planting in the United States, the USDA National Planting Zone. But be aware, if you're listening from somewhere else in New York State, there's many, many zones in New York State. And it's real interesting to bring a close-up of that map on the USDA site and see all the different planting zones and environments, microclimates in this state. You will find the time to fruition from seed transplant, and be aware the amount of time to harvest is from the time you either start the seed in the ground outside or you put your transplant in outside. And I actually experimented with this once with squash because I couldn't believe it. I just didn't believe that was true. And I got my plants were blooming inside. They were gorgeous. I took them out, transplanted them, and also put in seeds. And I couldn't believe it, but it's very accurate. I didn't get squash any quicker in the ones I grew early inside. It would tell you the spacing between leaves. It'll tell you how deep to put the seed and how tall the plant will grow and the temperature that you need to start growing. What do seeds need to grow? They need moisture, temperature, some light, and the right depth. And it's sort of that simple, hopefully. Be aware back to the seed packages. If you are buying tomatoes, look at that seed package if they're determinates or indeterminates. Determinates mean they're going to grow a certain height, 3-4 feet or so. They're going to stop. And they're going to give you so many tomatoes because when they stop growing and all those flowers come to fruit, that's the end of it. Where indeterminates are going to grow and grow. Usually they'll become 5 foot, 6 foot. I've even seen experts have 30 foot, no kidding. Well, maybe not 30, 20 foot tomato plants. They certainly have very good soil to get that. So you can pre-sprout your seeds, which will help you to get them going faster in your garden. Very simple. put it between a damp paper towel, put it in a little plastic bag overnight or for 24 hours, and then put them into the garden. All right. You can also test your old seeds. I do this periodically, and sometimes I have like 2 packages of pumpkins and I don't put down the date on my little wet paper towels. So just a heads up, you might want to do that because then you won't know which package was the 2010 and which one was the 2015 or whatever. But you can see from here, you can tell how many seeds you might need to put in the ground. And pumpkin is really easy, visible here. You can see I have 3 seeds. 2 did not grow and 1 did. So I had a 30% germination rate. So what I would do then is put 3 seeds in the ground instead of just 1, because I know, and this one did get a lot of nice roots and did grow outside. On the radishes, they're smaller, and sometimes they grow into the paper towel if you left them a day or so longer. You can actually take scissors and sort of cut around them and just put the paper towel right into the ground because it is degradable. If you're going to start your plants inside, you can use any kind of container. I mean, here's tofu container. Then there's an old food storage container that it didn't have a lid for. And here's these funny ones that look like clay pots. They're not. They're toilet paper tubes that have been cut a little and flipped in the bottom and a tea bag put down in there to keep the dirt from falling out. There are some links to that in our attachments at the end of this presentation. The one on the far right is a newspaper pot, and they're sort of fun to make as well and work very well. And of course, you can use citrus skins, egg cartons. I think egg cartons are hard because they dry out very quickly. A lot of people like pellet pots, Dixie cups, and some of these things like the toilet paper tubes and the newspaper pots, you can put them right into the soil and they will biodegrade. When you're going to plant indoors, you want to be sure your soil is slightly damp when you start to work with it. Like the tilth that you can't squeeze any water out, but it's just slightly damp. And you put that in about halfway, press it in, add a quarter more lightly without pressing, poke a little hole into the center of your pot. Most people like to put in at least 2 seeds. About 3 times the length of the longest part of your seed is the distance that you should have your seed in the soil. If you put 2 seeds in, that would be good, because if one doesn't grow, you have the other. You can always take one out or even divide it if you wanted to. And then cover lightly with some soil on top. Then you would water gently. But be aware, there are some of the tinier seeds, like petunias, that need to be exposed to light, so you don't bury them. You sprinkle them on top and just pat them down gently and then keep them moist, and you will have to spray them with a sprayer instead of, to be sure that they stay damp. Keep your seed trays damp, because if they do dry out, you've just killed your germinating seeds. Cover with a saran wrap or a clear lid. I actually, this year, I'm using a lot of spinach containers that you can get at Sam's or Wegmans when you buy spinach. They're the rectangular tubs, and they come with lids, and I've been using those, and boy, do they work really nice. When the green starts to grow, then you can take off those lids and just water as you would normally. This is seed tape, and this is sort of fun as a winter project. If you have really small seeds or you want things extremely organized in your garden, you read on the package it needs 1 inch or 2 between the seeds, you can take egg yolk and water and dab it on to where you want the seeds, or you can make a flour and water very basic paste and use that. Measure them out, put the seeds on the toilet paper, and just let it dry and roll it up. And then when it comes planting time, you can just take it out to your garden, make the furrow, and lay the toilet paper in there. Be sure that you label. Label, label, label. So important. You'll think of things maybe afterwards that you wish you'd put on that label. If you're having only one kind of tomato, then tomato's good enough. But I like to add dates. I even put dates on the food I put in my fridge, because then you have some kind of time frame to know in case you don't remember. Transplants are wonderful too, because in our area, some seeds take longer than 90 to 110 days. That's our growing season to grow. So you have no choice if you're going to grow them but to start them inside. You will need some light, and if you look carefully at this picture, you'll see there's a fluorescent container or light tube holder going across above the seeds. I have 2 bulbs in that. I use one cool bulb and a kitchen bath bulb. I did some research on this, and often plants need red frequency and blue frequency. And so that's what I found. I called the light bulb people and found out what frequencies these bulbs are. But you can also just use cool, because cool does have the frequency. Blue is the frequency for greenery, and usually you're not growing fruit inside. You're just getting them in the green stage where there's leaves, and so that will work. If you're going to grow seeds outdoors, you just need to prepare your bed, loosen the soil a little bit. Some people like to use rototillers, but there's been a lot of experimentation by not using rototillers. Maybe put a fork in and just turn the soil a little bit. And the reason for this is there's all kinds of webs of important nutrients that grow under your soil. There's all kinds of microbes, there's worms. And if you rototill, what you're doing is disturbing all of that, which is not great. And the other thing is you might be bringing seeds up from years ago to the top of the surface. And usually those seeds will be weed seeds that you really don't want. So loosen the soil just a little. And if you've covered it with a covering for winter, you're not going to have any weeds to deal with. Your soil is going to look pretty much like that. So it becomes very, very easy. Rake it out, dig your furrows, and there you go. You want to be sure when you plant your seeds that you put the radicular down. And the radicular is basically a little spot that looks different than the rest of the seed. And it's the point at which the seed was attached to the flower or the plant when it was being made. And again, you want to go 3 to 4 times as deep as the longest part of the seed. So the bigger seeds will, of course, go deeper into the ground. You can learn how to use measuring tape, of course, or you can use your finger for finger measuring. And that's basically find out where it is on your finger. Your first joint might be 1 inch from the end. And so if it says 1 inch deep, you can poke your finger in 1 inch, and there you have it. And see your seed package for how far apart you should put your seeds. And don't worry too much about that, because you can always thin, and thinning is good. Thinning is heartbreaking for me because I like the plant that's grown to stay. If you have heavy clay soil, it's a good idea to not put them quite as deep as they're suggested on the package. I like to cover them once I put them in the ground with a little bit of some kind of product that's a different color than the rest of my garden. So I might use vermicompost, and of course you're fertilizing at the same time then, or a little peat moss, or potting soil, and then I can see where the rows are, and it also makes the soil a little less difficult. I wouldn't put that clay soil on top because it's really hard then for the seeds to push up through. Then you need, or here we go, here's the different ways of putting things in the ground. But don't forget to water. And especially if you're transplanting, put in, for several days, put in maybe half a cup to a cup of water at each transplant for the first several days till those roots get rooted. It's best to water your transplants from the bottom. Let's look at different ways to put in seeds. Of course, you can use straight rows. This is called intercropping, where you put two crops together. These two are interesting because the lettuce is a surface crop grower and the carrots are a taproot grower. So you have those two types next to each other, not interfering with what's going on under the ground. And if you put the carrots on the north side, they also might shade the lettuce a little bit. You could also use pole beans to shade lettuce as well, because lettuce doesn't really care for hot weather. Here's another way. It's called banded. It's sort of a width of a space in a garden, larger than you would have a row. Some people like to plant two types of crops together right next to each other. It saves on walking space. And I also might add that you could dig a trench, not a trench, but a little space where you could walk, take that soil out, put it on top of where you're going to have your banded planting, so that the roots are growing in this higher soil, higher up than where you're walking, so you won't be compacting the roots. Sometimes people do this with companion planting as well, but you can just sort of scatter the seeds in here. This looks like beets and onions next to each other here. There's less weeds too when you plant things closer together. This is what we call hill planting. This is very common to use for squash and cucumbers. This actually started in England, where they had way too much water. And so in this way, the water would run off this little hill. This hill is maybe a foot and a half in diameter in all. It's not huge, of course. You can tell by those seedlings coming up. And then you're supposed to thin down to the strongest ones that you've planted. You put 4 or 5 in. You can also do concave planting for those plants that need more water. And squash actually needs a little more water than other plants. So instead of doing hills, you can just dig a little hole, and then more rain will go into that hole, and they'll hold a little more water for a little longer. Spacing, your package will tell you that. Garden books will tell you that. These are tomato plants that are well spaced. And you could plant something around the bottom of those so that when they grow, you're using more soil. You could put some lettuce in, maybe some beets. When to thin and how to thin. Thinning is very important, and because if you have, I've done this with beets. It's hard for me to thin things because they're my babies. But I have found if I don't really get a beet. I get beautiful greens, which is okay if you're just growing for greens, which I often do. You get nice greens, probably not as nice as if you have them separated. So every couple of weeks, once your greens come up, you should be looking at them to see if they need to be thinned according to the space on your package. But you don't want to thin when you see first green leaves. Those are called seed leaves, and they're also called cotyledons, the technical name. And above that, you'll get more leaves coming. And the second set of leaves is actually the true type of leaf. And at that point, then you can thin. Using scissors is a wonderful way to thin, because then you can eat what you cut out if it's an edible part of the plant, which in vegetable gardens, most of them are. And you don't disturb the other roots that are next to. Like I mentioned, my beets are so close. I can just clip off one beet here and there and eat those greens and not disturb the actual roots that are in the ground of the nearby plants. This is called friendly companions. There's an attachment at the end of this presentation also, that some plants will be synergistic with others, which means it will multiply its capability to grow well, and it also will eliminate pests. So garlic with strawberries is wonderful to keep the strawberry bugs away, and nasturtiums with squash helps to reduce pests as well. Marigolds with I believe tomatoes, but there's a whole list of things for you to see who goes well with who. Succession planting is another wonderful thing to think about, because you might love lettuce, but getting all your lettuce, like 2 bushel baskets full at the same time, is going to be hard to eat before it rots. So if you every 2 weeks put new seeds in the ground, then you'll have a nice rotating, continual production of lettuce. We need to rotate in the crop, and we have what's called crop families, vegetable families. And when you rotate crops, those families are considered like Brussels sprouts. I believe broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower are all in the same family. So you don't want to put any one of the same family in the same spot year after year. You want to rotate. That eliminates those type of pests from coming. And you also want to think about heavy feeders for nitrogen and plants that give nitrogen. And so that would be good to rotate those as well. I like to interplant, something new I've learned in the last year or so, because like I mentioned, some flowers keep pests away from the vegetable crops. And it also makes your garden look so much more eye-pleasing. You look down in there and you're so proud of yourself with what you grew, and then you see these beautiful blooms in between as well. It's just, I think it's so much better to do this planting flowers. And plus they attract pollinators, which you need, like to fertilize your tomato plants or even to get beans on your bean plants. So you can also think of cultures when you're planting. This Three Sisters garden is quite well known. It was an Indian method of planting where you put the corn in first, and a week or so later you put in pole beans, and the pole beans grow up the corn, and the corn stalks are their pole. And then another week later or so you put in the squash, and that covers the ground to keep weeds out. And so everybody's happy with everybody else there. The corn offers shade to the squash, and it's a pleasant time. Be sure, again, you label, mark your rows. And here's just a couple fun ways to do it. You can do old plastic spoons. These are used lids from canning, and they're on a wire, but you probably could put them on a stick as well. You could use paint stirring sticks, popsicle sticks. I have often used milk jugs or cottage cheese containers that I cut about 3/4 to 1 inch wide with a point on the bottom, and use those for markers. Or you could use rulers if you had an excess supply of them. And if you have pests in the garden, this fork reminds me, you could put forks throughout your garden, or I know somebody who puts tons of little sticks in between their plants to keep the rabbits out. And this is a beautiful way you want to label your rows, and fun for kids and maybe adults too who like art, to paint these rocks. Now, how do you know you have a healthy transplant? Here's two which both look like lovely tomato plants, but I would choose the one on the right. And the reason is because it's bushier, it's not as leggy, the roots are not as compacted, there's no discolored leaves, which there's none on the left either, but it's overall bushier. And if you do get a plant like on the left, then you'd want to use your fingers lightly or a fork to sort of pull some of those roots and separate them a little bit. When you transplant, be sure to have the leaves or the roots. The stems sometimes can be fragile and can be broken easily. If you want to separate starts, then you can just like put a fork in there, and that works really well, and just wiggle it gently around. Before doing this, water your plants at least an hour before, let them drain, or the night before. To transplant, you're going to want to dig a hole about twice the width as what the plant came in. You might want to add a little compost or fertilizer at the bottom of the hole. Push the plant up from the bottom of the pot if you can, upside down. Try not to disturb the roots too much, but separate them gently if they are clumped together. And then when you backfill your soil, you want to be sure that the soil you're putting in is not higher than where it was in the original plant. Now be careful when you get transplants. I don't want to scare you, but here we got some invasive guys they're the bad ones. These worms are very jumpy. When you pick them up, they dance like crazy, wiggle around. And the reason they're not great for your garden or anywhere around is that they eat all the detritus. They eat all the composted material and actually will make your ground sort of airy and sort of fall down. And so you want to look out for them. If you open a transplant up and you see this worm, then I would not use it. I would totally throw it into the garbage, not even your compost pile. You cannot see the seeds of the eggs of these worms. You cannot see them. They're super tiny. And the eggs do live over the winter. So watch out for these guys. And also when it comes to getting mulch or compost from elsewhere, ask and see if they have brought that temperature up to about 160 to kill the eggs of these critters. Here's tomatoes are a little different when you transplant them. They're interesting and sort of fun to play with. If you have a real leggy plant, you can fix that, not by cutting off your stem, but by cutting off some of your bottom leaves and then planting up to within 4 inches of the first top leaf. And this is another way you can do it, is by laying it in the ground. And if you look here, you can see these nodes where the old leaves used to be. And at every node, some roots will grow out of there. And this plant, of course, will straighten up. And just another point, which is interesting when I learned this, that the tomato plants shouldn't be watered as much as, you shouldn't keep them like wet all the time. And any plant, a little bit of drought is good for them because the plant says, oh my goodness, I don't have any water. And it starts to send its roots further down into the ground. If the further down into the ground the roots are, the more moist they will stay, which is great because if you ever get a time spell where you're having a little drought, then these plants will already be deeper where there's water staying longer than on the top getting dried out by the sun. And don't forget about the indeterminate and determinate plants. How big do you want those tomato plants to be? Also with tomato plants, they have this little nuance about them. In the crotch of where the plant and stem grow, you can see it like another plant growing. And you probably are thinking, how cool is that? I'm going to have the bushiest tomato plant. But actually it's called a sucker. And the reason it's called a sucker is because it sucks out the nutrients from the main stem of the plant and the flowers. You don't want those guys, at least not for the first couple feet of the plant. So you can just snip them out when they're small. They're pretty easy to tell in this V shape. You'll see this other stem growing up. It also, when you get rid of them, it allows more air. And I actually cut my tomato plants up, I don't know, 6 inches from the ground. I cut everything off because you want air going through there. You don't want your leaves on the ground. They can get disease from that. They can also get a fungus infection. So we don't want them to get moist. Need to water those seedlings, like I mentioned, every day. Keep the soil sort of like a wrung out sponge. And water from the bottom if you can. If you, again, like I mentioned, the fungus can grow on them. So it's best to water from the bottom, or if you have a sprinkler system and that's what you prefer to use, just be sure you're watering it early in the day so those leaves have a chance to dry out before night, because fungus loves cooler temperatures, which you do get at night, and wet. When it's time to take your transplants out, you have to do something we call boot camp or hardening off plants. And it's basically introducing your plants slowly to the climate outdoors. So It takes 5 days to 2 weeks, depending on how much of a hurry you are, but take them outside gradually. Go on the north side of a building or under a tree and take them into the shade for about an hour the first day, take them back in, bring them back out, maybe 2 hours the next day and 3 hours the next day until you're 4 or 5 hours a day in the shade. Then you can take them out into the sun. 1 hour the first day in the sun, 2 hours the next day, and so forth, until you have acclimated them. Be sure that you don't have to give them lots and lots of water when you're doing this. It can be water well before and drain, and then let them stay outside. And when it comes, they do toughen up. If you can brush them a little with your hand, use a fan on them a little before when you're starting to harden them. And that temperature change from in the house to outside also toughens them up. And when you're actually putting your transplants out for a permanent point in the garden, try to plant them on a cloudy day or in the evening so that the sun is not scorching them when you stick them in the water. And again, you need to water them maybe a cup a day for 3 or 4 days till they get acclimated. Sometimes when you do this, you put them out in the garden and you've done all this work and you're so excited, and then the cold comes. So we need to protect those babies. And you can do that with milk jugs that you've cut the bottom off from, soda bottles. You can get row covers. They work very well to give them a little protection. And sometimes it also protects them from bugs. Now, if you don't have a big garden like these guys, you can grow more things vertically. Here's some vertical growing, and you can see they've used an array of different things. You can use fencing, you can use bamboo stakes, and these could be pole beans on the right and put a plant or a squash plant at either point. Some people just use a couple poles with, like for beans or peas, with string, several layers of string going back and forth. The ideas are endless. You can see here, they've used an old crib spring, the fencing on the right, little teepees, all kinds of stuff. It's fun to figure out. If you don't, some of this might look like you got some junk in your yard, but once the plants grow, they look really pretty. And if you're growing melons or squash vertically, you can see this nice heavy cattle wire, fencing wire, works wonderful. But when the fruit grows, you might be worried it's going to fall off. So old stockings work, old t-shirts cut up or rags work great to tie them to the fence. In fact, it works better than string. When you're tying things in the garden, you might want to avoid string and use more of materials like cloth, because it does not cut into the stem as much. And just to make your life easier, you might want to get or create a tub truck. And a tub truck can be as simple as a 5-gallon bucket or a tin bucket. And you'll find that there'll be a lot of things that you'd like to take to your garden every time you go. Clippers, gloves, measuring tape, trowels, string, rag ties, maybe even a little metal can with soap and water for picking off the bigger bugs. But that can really help you. So when you get to your garden, you don't have to run back to the barn or your shed to get things that you need. And journaling is so much fun. And it's so helpful. When I mentioned that last year we had our last frost on June 6th, I would have never known that if I hadn't looked in my journal. It's fun. I like to write down things like the first time I see hostas poking their heads up, or when the lilac bush is getting a bud, those types of things, or the first robin sightings. So there's so much you can write, and that is helpful for the next year. So in the attachments that are coming up at the end, we have friendly companions, farmer almanac garden guides, crop rotation charts, potting mix recipes, and a few books that I have enjoyed using, and also the Genesee Cornell Cooperative Extension site had nice garden vegetable growing information. So thank you very much for letting me be with you today. And Jinjing has been collecting questions in the chats, and so I will entertain them now and hopefully be able to answer them. And thank you again.